He sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the graduation invitation on the table. The ceremony was just a week away, and he couldn't shake the heavy feeling in his chest. He had worked so hard for this moment, years of late-night studying, juggling part-time jobs, and pushing through countless challenges. But now, as the day approached, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loneliness. He had no family to call his own, no close friends to share his joy, and no one to celebrate this milestone with. The thought of walking across that stage to an empty audience made his heart ache. He had always been a quiet person, someone who kept to himself. Growing up in foster care, he had learned early on not to rely on others. People came and went, and he had stopped expecting anyone to stay. College had been his escape, a place where he could focus on building a better future for himself. But even there, he had struggled to connect with others. While his classmates formed study groups and hung out after class, he spent most of his time alone, buried in books or working extra shifts to make ends meet. As the days passed, the weight of his loneliness grew heavier. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself that it didn't matter who showed up. This was his achievement, and he should be proud of it. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the longing for someone, anyone, to be there for him. He thought about reaching out to a few acquaintances from college, but he quickly dismissed the idea. They had their own lives and families to celebrate with. Why would they care about him? The night before the graduation, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with doubts and fears. What if no one showed up? What if he was the only one sitting alone in the audience, waiting for his name to be called? He tried to shake off the negative thoughts, but they clung to him like a shadow. Finally, exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. The morning of the graduation, he woke up early, his stomach in knots. He dressed carefully in his cap and gown, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he forced a smile. "This is your day," he whispered to himself. "You've earned this." He arrived at the venue early, his heart pounding as he walked through the doors. The auditorium was slowly filling up with graduates and their families. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but he felt like an outsider looking in. He found a quiet corner and sat down, clutching his program tightly. He scanned the room, hoping to see a familiar face, but there was no one. As the ceremony began, he took his seat among the other graduates. The speeches and awards blurred together as he tried to focus on the moment. But his mind kept drifting back to the empty seats in the audience. He felt a lump in his throat and blinked back tears. This wasn't how he had imagined this day. Finally, it was time for the graduates to walk across the stage. One by one, names were called, and the audience erupted in applause. He watched as his classmates hugged their families and friends, their faces glowing with pride and happiness. His turn was coming up, and he felt his hands trembling. When his name was called, he took a deep breath and stood up. He walked slowly to the stage, his heart racing. As he reached the podium, he glanced out at the audience, bracing himself for the silence. But what he saw next took his breath away. The auditorium was filled with people he didn't even know. Strangers were standing up, clapping and cheering for him. Some held signs with his name on them, while others waved and smiled. For a moment, he was frozen in shock. Who were these people? Why were they here for him? As he stood there, overwhelmed, a woman from the audience stepped forward. She explained that she had heard his story through a friend of a friend. He had mentioned in passing that he didn't think anyone would come to his graduation, and it had struck a chord with her. She had shared his story online, and the response had been incredible. People from all over the community had come together to make sure he didn't walk across that stage alone. Tears streamed down his face as he realized what was happening. These strangers had shown up for him, not out of obligation, but out of kindness and compassion. They had given him something he had never dared to hope for, a sense of belonging. As he walked off the stage, the applause still ringing in his ears, he felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. After the ceremony, he stood outside the auditorium, still trying to process what had just happened. The crowd of strangers who had cheered for him began to gather around, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of encouragement. He was overwhelmed by their kindness, but also a little unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not from so many people who genuinely seemed to care about him. The woman who had first shared his story approached him with a warm smile. She introduced herself and explained how his story had touched her heart. "I just couldn't let you go through this day alone," she said. "You deserve to be celebrated, just like everyone else." He thanked her, his voice trembling with emotion. He didn't know what else to say. How do you thank someone for giving you something you didn't even know you needed? As the crowd began to disperse, a small group of people stayed behind. They invited him to join them for a celebration at a nearby cafe. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting invitations or being around people for too long. But something inside him told him to say yes. This was a day of firsts, after all. The cafe was cozy and filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. The group found a large table and made room for him to sit. They introduced themselves one by one, sharing a little about their lives and why they had decided to come to his graduation. Some were parents who had been moved by his story, others were students who had faced their own struggles and wanted to show support. Each person had a reason for being there, and each reason made him feel more and more like he mattered. As they talked and laughed, he began to relax. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. These people didn't know him, but they had chosen to be there for him anyway. It was a strange and beautiful feeling, one he couldn't quite put into words. One of the women at the table, a teacher, leaned over and said, "You know, your story has inspired so many people. It's a reminder that we all need each other, even if we don't always realize it." He nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He had spent so much of his life trying to be independent, to prove that he didn't need anyone. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The celebration lasted for hours, but eventually, it was time to say goodbye. As he walked home that evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of loneliness that had been pressing on his chest for years seemed a little lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. The next few days were a whirlwind. His story had gone viral online, and he began receiving messages from people all over the world. Some shared their own stories of loneliness and struggle, while others simply wanted to congratulate him and wish him well. He was amazed by the outpouring of support, but also a little overwhelmed. He wasn't used to so much attention, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. One message, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a man who had grown up in foster care, just like him. The man wrote about how he had felt alone for most of his life, but how he had eventually found a sense of belonging through a community of people who had been through similar experiences. He invited him to join a support group for former foster youth, saying, "You don't have to go through life alone. There are people who understand what you've been through, and they're here for you." The message struck a chord with him. He had always thought of his past as something to be ashamed of, something to hide from the world. But maybe it was time to stop running from it. Maybe it was time to reach out and connect with others who had walked a similar path. He decided to attend the next support group meeting. It was held in a small community center, and as he walked through the doors, he felt a mix of nerves and curiosity. The room was filled with people of all ages, each with their own story to tell. He found a seat near the back and listened as others shared their experiences. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not in front of a group. But something about the room felt safe, like he could finally let his guard down. He took a deep breath and began to share his story, his childhood in foster care, his struggles with loneliness, and the incredible kindness he had experienced at his graduation. As he spoke, he noticed heads nodding in understanding. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. People came up to him afterward, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about how much his life had changed in just a few short days. He had gone from feeling completely alone to being surrounded by people who cared about him. It was a strange and wonderful feeling, one he wasn't sure he deserved. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he did. The days turned into weeks, and he found himself settling into a new rhythm. The support group became a regular part of his life, and he began to form connections with the people there. For the first time, he felt like he had a place where he belonged. It wasn't just about sharing his struggles, it was about being seen and understood. He started to open up more, not just about his past, but about his hopes and dreams for the future. One evening after a support group meeting, he stayed behind to talk to one of the group leaders, a kind woman in her 50s who had been through the foster system herself. She had a way of making people feel at ease, and he found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't with anyone else. "You've come a long way," she said, smiling warmly. "But I can tell there's still something holding you back." "What is it?" He hesitated, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I guess I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I let myself get too close to people, they'll leave. Or that I'll mess things up somehow." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a natural fear, especially after everything you've been through. But you can't let it control you. You deserve to have people in your life who care about you. And you deserve to let yourself be happy." Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. He knew she was right, but it was easier said than done. Letting people in meant being vulnerable, and that was something he had spent most of his life avoiding. Around the same time, he started receiving invitations to speak at events. His story had inspired so many people, and organizations wanted him to share his journey with others. At first, he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't exactly his forte, and the thought of standing in front of a crowd made him nervous. But something inside him told him to give it a try. His first speaking engagement was at a local high school. The audience was filled with students, teachers, and community members. As he stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly, he took a deep breath and began to speak. He talked about his childhood, his struggles with loneliness, and the incredible kindness he had experienced at his graduation. He shared how he had learned to open up and let people in, even when it felt scary. As he spoke, he noticed the audience hanging on his every word. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Afterward, several people came up to him, thanking him for sharing his story and telling him how much it had meant to them. One student, a shy girl with tears in her eyes, said, "Your story made me feel like I'm not alone. Thank you." That moment stayed with him. For the first time, he realized that his story had the power to help others. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about giving hope to people who felt the way he once had. As the weeks went by, he continued to speak at events, each time growing a little more confident. He also started volunteering at a local organization that supported foster youth. It felt good to give back, to be there for kids who were going through the same struggles he had faced. One day, while volunteering, he met a young boy who reminded him so much of himself at that age. The boy was quiet and reserved, keeping to himself as the other kids played and laughed. He sat down next to the boy and struck up a conversation. At first, the boy was hesitant to talk, but slowly, he began to open up. "I don't have anyone," the boy said quietly. "No one cares about me." His heart ached at the words. He knew exactly how the boy felt. "I used to feel that way too," he said. "But you're not alone. There are people who care about you, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt. "Really? Really," he said, smiling. "And if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." That conversation stayed with him long after the day ended. It reminded him of how far he had come, but also of how much work there was still to do. There were so many kids out there who felt the way he once had, lost, alone, and unsure of their place in the world. He wanted to be there for them, to show them that they mattered. As he continued to volunteer and speak at events, he began to feel a sense of purpose he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was making a difference. But even as he poured his energy into helping others, he couldn't ignore the lingering fear that still held him back. One evening, after a long day of volunteering, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the walls. The silence felt heavy, and he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that crept in. He thought about the connections he had made, the people who had shown him kindness and support. But deep down, he still felt like he was holding something back. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at the name of someone he had met at a recent event. They had exchanged numbers and talked about getting coffee, but he had never followed through. He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the call button. "You deserve to have people in your life who care about you," the group leader's words echoed in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. The phone rang a few times before the person on the other end picked up. It was the woman he had met at the event, a kind, outgoing person who had shared her own story of overcoming adversity. She sounded surprised but happy to hear from him. They made plans to meet for coffee the following weekend, and as he hung up, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. When the day arrived, he found himself pacing around his apartment, second-guessing his decision. What if they didn't have anything to talk about? What if it was awkward? But he pushed the thoughts aside and forced himself to go. The cafe was cozy and filled with the hum of conversation. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in hand. She waved him over with a warm smile, and he felt some of his nerves ease. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. She had a way of making him feel at ease, and he found himself opening up in a way he hadn't with many people. By the time they left the cafe, he felt a sense of connection he hadn't felt in a long time. That meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He started reaching out to people more, making an effort to build relationships instead of keeping everyone at arm's length. It wasn't always easy, there were moments of doubt and fear, but he reminded himself of what the group leader had said: he deserved to have people in his life who cared about him. As he continued to volunteer and speak at events, he also began to focus on his own dreams. For years, he had put his goals on hold, telling himself he wasn't ready or that he didn't deserve to pursue them. But now, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He started taking small steps toward his dreams, whether it was signing up for a class or working on a personal project. One of those dreams was to write a book about his experiences. He had always loved writing, but he had never thought of himself as someone who could write a book. Still, the idea wouldn't leave him alone. He started jotting down notes and ideas, slowly piecing together the outline of a story. Writing became a form of therapy for him. It allowed him to process his emotions and reflect on his journey in a way he hadn't before. As he wrote, he began to see his life in a new light, not as a series of struggles, but as a story of resilience and hope. One day, while working on his book, he received a message from the young boy he had met while volunteering. The boy had written him a letter, thanking him for their conversation and telling him how much it had meant. "You made me feel like I'm not alone," the boy wrote. "I hope I can be like you someday." The letter brought tears to his eyes. It reminded him of why he was doing all of this, not just for himself, but for others who felt the way he once had. He wrote back to the boy, encouraging him and letting him know that he was always there if he needed someone to talk to. As the months went by, he continued to build connections and work toward his goals. He still had moments of doubt and fear, but they didn't hold him back the way they used to. He had learned to lean on the people in his life, to let them in even when it felt scary. One evening, he was invited to speak at a large event in front of hundreds of people. It was the biggest audience he had ever faced, and as he stood backstage, waiting for his turn, he felt a wave of nerves wash over him. The group leader, who had become a mentor and friend, was there with him. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You've got this. Just speak from the heart." Taking a deep breath, he walked out onto the stage. The spotlight was bright, and the audience was a sea of faces. For a moment, he felt the old fear creeping in, the fear of not being enough, of not belonging. But then he thought about everything he had been through, the people who had shown him kindness, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. He began to speak, his voice steady and strong. He shared his story, the struggles, the loneliness, the moments of hope and connection. He talked about the importance of reaching out, of letting people in, and of believing in yourself even when it feels impossible. As he spoke, he noticed the audience hanging on his every word. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, their faces filled with emotion. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized the impact his words had had. After the event, he was surrounded by people who wanted to thank him and share their own stories. One woman, tears streaming down her face, said, "Your story gave me hope. I've been feeling so alone, but now I know I'm not." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about how far he had come. He had gone from feeling completely alone to standing on a stage, inspiring hundreds of people. It was a surreal feeling, one he never could have imagined. But even as he celebrated his progress, he knew his journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people in his life who cared about him, and he had a purpose that gave him strength. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days following the big event were a whirlwind. Messages poured in from people who had heard his story, each one filled with gratitude and encouragement. He spent hours responding to emails and letters, his heart swelling with the realization that his words had touched so many lives. It was humbling and overwhelming all at once. Amid the chaos, he continued to work on his book. Writing had become a sanctuary for him, a place where he could process his thoughts and reflect on his journey. He poured his heart into every page, weaving together the highs and lows of his life into a story of resilience and hope. One afternoon, as he was editing a chapter, his phone buzzed with a call from the group leader. Her voice was warm but urgent. "I have someone I'd like you to meet," she said. "She's a publisher, and I think she'd be very interested in your book." His heart skipped a beat. A publisher? He had never imagined his book would go beyond a personal project. The idea of sharing it with the world was both thrilling and terrifying. A few days later, he found himself sitting across from the publisher in a cozy office filled with books. She was a sharp, kind woman who listened intently as he shared his story and his vision for the book. When he finished, she leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "This is exactly the kind of story the world needs right now," she said. "I'd love to work with you to bring it to life." He left the meeting feeling a mix of excitement and disbelief. His book, the one he had started as a way to process his own experiences, was going to be published. It was a dream he hadn't even dared to dream, and now it was coming true. As he worked with the publisher to refine the manuscript, he also continued to speak at events and volunteer with foster youth. His life felt fuller than ever, but it wasn't without its challenges. Balancing everything was exhausting, and there were moments when he felt like he was spreading himself too thin. One evening, after a particularly long day, he sat down with the group leader to talk about how he was feeling. "I don't want to let anyone down," he admitted. But sometimes it feels like there's just too much to do." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've taken on a lot, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But remember, you don't have to do everything alone. It's okay to ask for help." Her words stayed with him. He had spent so much of his life trying to be independent, to prove that he didn't need anyone. But now, he realized that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. He started reaching out to the people in his life, asking for support when he needed it. Whether it was help with editing the book or just someone to talk to, he found that people were more than willing to lend a hand. It was a new experience for him, one that brought him closer to the people around him. As the publication date for his book approached, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He had poured so much of himself into the project, and now it was about to be out in the world. He wondered how people would react, if his story would resonate with them the way he hoped it would. The day the book was released, he woke up early, his stomach in knots. He spent the morning refreshing his email, waiting for updates on how it was doing. By midday, the messages started pouring in. Readers from all over the world shared how much the book had meant to them, how it had given them hope and inspired them to keep going. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a young woman who had grown up in foster care, just like him. She wrote about how his story had made her feel seen and understood, how it had given her the courage to reach out for help. "You've changed my life," she wrote. "Thank you." Tears filled his eyes as he read her words. It was moments like these that made everything worth it, the late nights, the moments of doubt, the fear of putting himself out there. His story was making a difference, and that was all he had ever wanted. As the weeks went by, the book continued to gain traction. He was invited to more events, interviewed on podcasts, and featured in articles. It was a surreal experience, one he never could have imagined. But through it all, he stayed grounded, reminding himself of why he had started this journey in the first place. One evening, after a book signing event, he sat down with the young boy he had met while volunteering. The boy had read the book and wanted to talk about it. They sat together, sharing stories and laughter, and for a moment, he felt like he was looking at a younger version of himself. "I want to write a book someday," the boy said, his eyes shining with determination. He smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he said. "And if you ever need help, I'm here." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about how far he had come. He had gone from feeling completely alone to being surrounded by people who cared about him. He had turned his pain into purpose, his struggles into strength. But even as he celebrated his progress, he knew his journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people in his life who cared about him, and he had a purpose that gave him strength. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The success of his book brought new opportunities, but it also brought new challenges. He found himself juggling more responsibilities than ever before: book tours, interviews, speaking engagements, and his ongoing volunteer work. It was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. There were days when he felt like he was running on empty, pushing himself to keep up with the demands of his new life. One morning, he woke up feeling unusually drained. The weight of everything he was carrying seemed to press down on him, and he struggled to get out of bed. He had always been someone who pushed through, no matter how tired or overwhelmed he felt. But this time, it was different. This time, he couldn't ignore the signs that he was burning out. He decided to take a step back and reevaluate his priorities. He reached out to the group leader, who had become a trusted mentor, and shared how he was feeling. She listened patiently, then said, "You've accomplished so much, but you can't pour from an empty cup. It's okay to slow down and take care of yourself." Her words resonated with him. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself, to show that he was strong enough to handle anything. But now, he realized that true strength wasn't about pushing through at all costs, it was about knowing when to pause and recharge. He started making small changes to his routine, carving out time for rest and self-care. He began to say no to some of the opportunities that came his way, even though it felt uncomfortable at first. He reminded himself that it wasn't about letting people down, it was about staying true to himself and his well-being. One of the things he decided to focus on was reconnecting with the people in his life. He had been so busy that he hadn't had much time to spend with friends or even just relax and enjoy their company. He reached out to the woman he had met at the cafe, and they made plans to meet up for dinner. The evening was filled with laughter and easy conversation. It felt good to just be present, to enjoy the moment without worrying about what was next. As they talked, he realized how much he had missed this, the simple joy of connecting with someone on a deeper level. "I'm glad we did this," he said as they parted ways that night. "I've been so caught up in everything that I forgot how important it is to just be." She smiled. "Me too. Let's not wait so long next time." As he continued to prioritize balance in his life, he also began to reflect on what he wanted for the future. His book had opened so many doors, but he knew it was just the beginning. He wanted to do more, not just for himself, but for others who were struggling the way he once had. One idea that kept coming up was starting a foundation to support foster youth. He had seen firsthand how much of a difference it could make to have someone in your corner, and he wanted to create a space where young people could find the resources and support they needed to thrive. He shared the idea with the group leader, who immediately offered her support. "It's a big undertaking," she said, "but I think it's exactly what you're meant to do." With her guidance, he began to lay the groundwork for the foundation. It was a daunting task, but he approached it with the same determination that had carried him through so many challenges. He reached out to people in his network, sharing his vision and asking for their help. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life offered their time, resources, and expertise. It was a reminder of how much good there was in the world, and how much could be accomplished when people came together for a common cause. As the foundation began to take shape, he also started working on a new project, a memoir that delved deeper into his journey, exploring not just the struggles but also the lessons he had learned along the way. Writing had become a way for him to process his experiences and share them with others, and he was excited to dive into this new chapter. One evening, as he was working on the memoir, he received a message from the young boy he had met while volunteering. The boy had been accepted into a mentorship program and wanted to thank him for inspiring him to keep going. "You showed me that it's possible to turn your life around," the boy wrote. "I'll never forget that." Tears filled his eyes as he read the message. It was moments like these that reminded him why he was doing all of this, not just for himself, but for the people who came after him. As he sat down to write that night, he felt a sense of clarity and purpose. He had come so far, but he knew his journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people in his life who cared about him, and he had a purpose that gave him strength. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The foundation officially launched a few months later, and the response was beyond anything he could have imagined. People from all over the country reached out to offer their support, and soon, the foundation was able to provide resources, mentorship, and scholarships to foster youth in need. It was a dream come true, but it was also a lot of work. He found himself juggling the demands of running the foundation, working on his memoir, and continuing to speak at events. Despite the busyness, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Every time he received a message from a young person who had been helped by the foundation, he was reminded of why he had started it in the first place. It wasn't just about giving back, it was about creating a ripple effect of hope and change. One day, he received a letter from a young woman who had aged out of the foster system and was struggling to find her place in the world. She had been on the verge of giving up when she came across his book and learned about the foundation. With their help, she had been able to enroll in college and was now pursuing her dream of becoming a social worker. "You saved my life," she wrote. "I don't know where I'd be without you." The letter brought tears to his eyes. It was a powerful reminder of the impact one person could have, and it fueled his determination to keep going. As the foundation grew, so did his connections with the people around him. He had built a network of friends, mentors, and supporters who believed in his vision and were there to help him every step of the way. It was a far cry from the loneliness he had once felt, and he was grateful for it every day. One evening, he was invited to speak at a gala celebrating the foundation's first year. The event was held in a grand ballroom, filled with people who had supported the cause. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, he felt a surge of emotion. "This foundation isn't just about me," he began. "It's about all of us coming together to make a difference. It's about showing young people who have been through so much that they matter, that they have a future, and that they are not alone." The room erupted in applause, and he felt a swell of pride. This was what it was all about, creating a community of love and support for those who needed it most. After the speech, he was approached by a man who had been in the audience. The man introduced himself as a former foster youth who had gone on to become a successful entrepreneur. He shared his own story of struggle and triumph, and then said, "I want to help. Whatever you need, I'm here." It was moments like these that reminded him of the power of connection. Every person in that room had a story, and together, they were creating something bigger than themselves. As the night went on, he found himself reflecting on his journey. He had come so far from the lonely, uncertain young man who had once sat alone at his graduation, wondering if anyone would show up. Now, he was surrounded by people who cared about him, who believed in him, and who were there to support him. But even as he celebrated his progress, he knew his journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people in his life who cared about him, and he had a purpose that gave him strength. The following week, he returned to the support group that had been such a big part of his journey. It felt like coming full circle, sitting in that familiar room, surrounded by people who understood what it was like to struggle and to overcome. When it was his turn to speak, he shared how far he had come, not just in terms of his accomplishments, but in terms of his growth as a person. "I used to think I had to do everything on my own," he said. "But I've learned that it's okay to lean on others, to ask for help, and to let people in. That's where the real strength comes from." The group listened intently, nodding in understanding. When he finished, they erupted in applause, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. These people had been there for him when he needed it most, and he would always be grateful for their support. As he left the meeting that night, he felt a sense of peace. He had come so far, but he knew there was still more to do. There were still young people out there who needed hope, still stories to be told, and still connections to be made. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as he walked home under the stars, he smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over.